So here we are at 11:59. And so without any further ado, the first thing I'm going to do is introduce Faith Justice. She is the president of the New York City Chapter. So Faith, if you can unmute your mic, there we go, and say hello.
Well, hello everybody, and welcome to this presentation of Stories of Plague in the Time of COVID, which I feel is just completely timely, particularly since my zip code just got upgraded to level 2 in New York City. For those of you who don't know, that means we're going on to lockdown again, because we do have some communities who don't seem to like to wear their masks and put everybody else in danger. So wear your mask, wash your hands, social distance. But I don't want to complain too much, because we have with us a wonderful group of people who are here to talk to us about their stories that they wrote about the time of plague in We All Fall Down. And again, highly recommend people get the book. I was one of those people who was very pleased to be able to read it in advance, and I enjoyed it immensely. So very much looking forward to all your conversations about this. And I just have one little housekeeping thing, and then I'm going to turn it over to Lisa and let her get us all up to speed on this. So as Susan mentioned, we've got all our information in the chat. Those of you who got our Zoom links by email, all of our information is at the bottom of the email, so you can whitelist us and you can follow us and do all that good stuff. And next month we will be having our meeting on Monday, November the 16th at 6 o'clock in the evening. And we're going to be doing another, I hope, very timely discussion, because we're going to be talking with Carrie Hayes, who's the author of The Naked Truth. And her book is about Victoria Woodhull, the first US woman to run for president of the United States. So whether or not we have a female vice president in the offing, this should be a very interesting discussion. So without further ado, again, welcome. Thank you very much, Susan, for all your hard work on this, Lisa for getting the panel together, and thank you especially to all of our panelists. So Lisa, take it away.
Thank you so much, Faith. Again, I would also like to extend my thanks and welcome to everyone who has joined us today. I know if you are a regular attendee of our chapter meetings via Zoom, that this may be a somewhat unusual time for us to be meeting, but this was done so that we could accommodate all of the wonderful authors who wanted to be a part of this presentation. First, I would really like to thank the New York City chapter for providing us with this forum in which we could speak to our attendees. I also want to give a very heartfelt thanks to my fellow authors who gave so much of their time, their wonderful energy, and their excellent storytelling to making this anthology a success. And lastly, I'd like to thank all of our attendees again who are here with us. Something I wanted to mention, because it's come up in a couple of the reviews of the anthology, as well as I've had a couple of people ask me, so when you all came up with this idea of We All Fall Down, Stories of Plague and Resilience, did you plan to do this during the time of COVID? Absolutely not. When we were each getting together back in 2018, when we were writing all of these stories and putting together our contributions, I can guarantee you, none of us could have ever anticipated that we would be then debuting this anthology during such a time as COVID, which has impacted the world. Nor did we have any idea, as we were each individually writing, the way in which we would create the synthesis between all of our stories is that while they are set within a period in Europe where the Black Death and plague were very dominant, that our stories really, they honestly have the approach for every one of us became this idea that the Black Death is but a backdrop. These are stories more so about the human condition more than anything else. And I was very pleased to see that synthesis happened. It was something that we had not gotten together and planned, but we each managed to do it and create this wonderful collection. I am now going to turn it over to my fellow authors to give each of them the opportunity to introduce themselves and to share a bit about their contribution to the anthology. We're going to do this by author last name in alphabetical order. So first up is David Blixt. David?
Hi there, thanks Lisa, and thanks everyone for having me, and I'm so appreciative of being here. My story is a confluence of a lot of stuff I've already been focusing on. I do a lot of theater, and my version of this, my tale, is titled On All Our Houses, which is a paraphrasing of a line from Romeo and Juliet when Mercutio curses the families, "A plague on both your houses." Well, it was a plague on everyone's house at this point. My first novel was the backstory to Romeo and Juliet, so it seemed perfectly appropriate to extend out to past where the series ends. The hero of my series was Dante's son, Pietro Alighieri, and I had the good fortune a decade ago to go and visit the family house that Pietro bought in 1353. Where the family still lives and has a vineyard. Having toured that house and knowing that Pietro had two daughters who died of the plague after it hit, and also that Dante's son Pietro was friends with Petrarch, it seemed the perfect confluence of all of these things: Shakespeare, Dante, and Petrarch. Petrarch, who lost his brother and wrote very tellingly about the plague during his lifetime. So all of these things come together. I follow Pietro near the end of his life, as he's lost one daughter already and another is dying upstairs. And it is a look at grief and loss and the absolute pain of helplessness. And it fits in perfectly with our theme of resilience, because he did keep going. So that's my tale in there.
Excellent, excellent. Next up is Jean Gill.
Okay, I didn't realize I had to do the unmuting. I thought Big Brother was controlling all of this.
You just beat me to it.
That's great. Bonsoir from Provence in France. I'm one of the ones that means it has to be a different time of day than it would usually be. My story is called A Certain Shade of Red. So as you can see, I'm trying to go for atmosphere in the background, but it seems to be overdoing the red at the moment. So you'll have to put up with whatever happens on the lighting. Imagine yourself in Venice in 1576, and the plague is back. You've been through this before. You didn't know that you were going to have to keep going through it. Nobody is safe, not the powerful, not the wealthy, and not the celebrities either. And Venice's most famous painter is dying during August 1576. Does Titian have the plague or not? Nobody seems to know. They didn't know then, perhaps, and there's certainly no agreement on it in our time. The historians disagree, which is where a novelist can have a lot of fun and actually look at the mystery and see what happens next. And while I was researching what was going on in this period, I found a very strange tale of two doctors in Venice who were both responsible for deciding who lived, who died, who had plague and who hadn't, but they were brothers-in-law and rivals. So I figured that had something to do with what happened to Titian. And from my point of view for the story, I thought there was only really one person who takes the long view on plague. And we could do with that at the moment, that we're not thinking of the everyday and the statistics, but that we're seeing it as part of history. And I'm going to read you just the opening, and I think you'll guess who the narrator is. I'm not supposed to have favorites or to feel anything. Yet I watch this man sweat and thrash about on his stinking bed, and I wonder whether I will offer him one last gift. I know what he hopes and what he fears even now. We have history together. The Dolomite Mountains watch us through the north-facing window of his workshop. They are misty-eyed with summer, but they remain stone, as they should be. I am neither misty-eyed nor stone. I'm not supposed to dance either, but you'll see me portrayed everywhere, whirling the human chain in a hop-skip ballo that links lady with leper, tinker with trollop, doge with dullard in the final music. Everyone dances in the end, holding hands or what remains of them. Some call me the great leveler. You know who I am. Thank you.
Wow, thank you, Jean. That was beautiful. It was absolutely beautiful. Next up is Kristin Gleeson.
Right. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, grand. Right, I'm Kristin Gleeson and I'm here in Ireland where I've been living for the last 16 years. Thank you, Lisa, for putting all this together, for getting us together as a group. I really appreciate it. It's been a wonderful experience. And thank you too to the chapter, the New York chapter of the Historical Novel Society for hosting us. It's a kind of unusual event to be here in the middle of COVID to be talking about plague, which is something I would never have imagined when I wrote this story. I really just can't believe we're in this kind of situation. But when I was wanting to write the story, it was growing out of my love of the area in which I live, which has a huge tradition around a early medieval saint, St. Gubnet, whose place of birth or her place of living and where she set up a convent was in my community. And the whole tradition is about healing, and her community of women were known for the honey and the bees that they kept and how they would go out into the community and heal the community. So when I wrote a book in Praise the Bees, which was set in 6th century Ireland in the time of St. Gubnet and her life, I loved it so much, creating the time period, and really understood that the experience of medieval Ireland was very different to the rest of Europe. And so when Lisa asked me to join this anthology, I decided I wanted to go back to this community and set my story in the time of the plague, which was 1349, and use that as a springboard for my story. And so I centered it around a young postulant named Maeve, who is there with the community, and they are fearing that the plague is spreading westwards from the Norman port city of Cork. So they are hoping that it won't touch the Irish communities that are there. But she gets a summons from her mother to attend her father, who's desperately ill. And so she decides to go and makes a journey with this young new convent laborer named Diarmuid. And she has no idea what she's going to find. And on her journey, she realizes if it is the plague, she won't be able to return to the convent and take up the veil permanently. So this is a real test of her understanding of her vocation and her faith and her duty to her family. And all the different ties we have in this time of pressure and crisis is what can come to the story and maybe have meaning for us too. And her relationship with Diarmuid changes as the journey progresses, and she encounters signs of plague, the very fears that she had that it was spreading westward. And so as she arrives at her house and she discovers that there's something maybe more sinister at work there, she realizes that it's her spirit that will be tested, as well as her cunning and her skill with healing. And so it was an opportunity to explore that kind of idea of resilience, testing your faith, and understanding who you really are, that I wanted to bring to the story.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you so much, Kristin. Next up, we have Jessica Knauss.
Hello, everyone. I'm very happy to be coming to you from beautiful, historic Zamora, Spain. We're doing okay so far in what they're calling the second wave, but there are several communities around us that are starting to basically close their borders. So it's definitely a medieval feel going on right now. So my historical fiction takes place in medieval Spain. So for this anthology, I landed on the historical figure of Leonor Núñez de Guzmán y Ponce de León. As you can tell by the very long name, she was the most powerful woman in Spain before the Black Death. But after the Black Death, she lived the last years of her life humiliated and imprisoned. So I think that my story may be the least obviously hopeful of the bunch. We have to look outside the historical record to get an uplifting message, which is that Leonor was the mother of the man who would become Enrique II of Castile. He began the Trastámara dynasty, which would rule Spain for another 150 years. So in the end, even though she suffered greatly, her legacy lasted a very long time. And although the historical Leonor did not get to see her family rise to greatness in the story in this anthology, I gave her a little bit of foresight so that she could at least suffer with a purpose. So her resilience doesn't go completely unrewarded in my story.
Okay, excellent. Thank you so much, Jessica. Okay, next up, we have Laura Morelli.
Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for having me. I'm Laura Morelli. I'm an art historian and historical novelist, and I'm coming to you today from Raleigh, North Carolina. Beautiful sunny day. And I love the geographic diversity of this group of authors. I think it's just really cool that we came together from all different points of the globe to focus on this theme. Well, this is not my first rodeo, you might say, with the Black Death. The plague is a topic that has interested me and intrigued me for a long time. One of my novels, The Painter's Apprentice, is set during plague times in 16th century Venice. I've also written another couple of plague short stories, one called Bridge of Sighs, which is also set in Venice, and you can download that for free on my website. With this story for We All Fall Down, I decided to move to medieval Siena and focus on the summer of 1348, which was a particularly devastating time period in all of Europe, but especially in Tuscany. And at that time, they called it the Great Mortality. It wiped out, some historians think, up to 60% of Europe's population. And certainly Siena was one of the hardest hit cities in Europe during that plague. And it's always been fascinating to me to think about how people dealt with mental and physical health challenges in pre-modern times. This is a theme that I seem to come back to in a lot of my stories. I just think it's a fascinating thing to realize and to really understand how resilient humans are. And I think as human beings, we come to stories to consider how we would react when put through a really difficult test. And so that's one of the things that I think is really cool about this collection of stories. Well, my story for this anthology is called Little Bird. Uccellina is the nickname of this little girl who is the protagonist of my story. She is traveling across central Italy in a wagon with a kind of nefarious group of characters who are outcasts in their own right, and they're traveling from town to town, hawking their wares off the back of this cart. And they show up in Siena offering quote unquote cures for the plague. Well, you can imagine that some of the townspeople are more suspicious than others, and our little bird finds herself in the crosshairs as people around the town begin to fall victim to the plague. One of the things that was fascinating for me in putting together this story was looking at the primary sources. Whenever I start a new book or a new short story, I always begin with the primary sources, things that people wrote about at the time. And for 14th century Tuscany, we have a lot of very fascinating chronicles that describe the reality of plague during this time. A Florentine chronicler of 1348 described bodies and earth piled one on top of the other, almost like making lasagna. So I think that's a particularly vivid image. And the other thing that I brought into the story are the Lorenzetti brothers. Ambrogio and his brother Piero were both a successful artist in Siena during this time. We have Ambrogio Lorenzetti's last will, which he signed in June of 1348, and then he also disappears from the public record. So unfortunately, he seems to have fallen victim to this same plague. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to read our stories, and we look forward to your questions. Thanks, Lisa.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Laura. Next up, Deborah Swift.
Hello, everybody. My internet's coming and going. I'm in Cumbria in England, which is a very rural place. So if I keep zoning in and out, that's why. It's lovely to be here in amongst all these other authors from all over the world. And my story is called The Repentant Thief. One of the reasons I wanted to write it was because I just finished a book about the plague. And I think that's why Lisa approached me and wondered if I'd be interested in doing this. But I didn't want to revisit the same place again. So I looked further back in history and came across a story of the Edinburgh Plague, which took place in 1645 and was in fact more severe than the plague that took place in 1666, which is the one in England that we've all heard of, where a lot of Londoners died. But very few people knew about the Edinburgh plague. So I wanted to focus on that. And my first starting point was the map of Edinburgh, which showed you this very tightly packed group of houses, all tenements, one story on top of another. And when the plague struck, it really struck hard, and more than 70% of the population died. To look into this story, I decided to use a child protagonist, because I thought, what would they make of it if suddenly all these people around them dying? How would they interpret that? And I also wanted to look at how they might have interpreted it in a religious point of view. So my story is about Finn, an Irish immigrant who decides to go to church with his family one day. He's a bit of a scamp. He's stolen some jewelry from somebody. And when he gets to church, he hears the preacher talking about how sin is repaid by plague and death. Of course, the plague and death start to happen. His family start to die. And poor Finn wonders, is it his fault? Have I done something? Is it something that I can do something about? When his brother dies, is it his fault? So he has some soul searching to do. And in the end, he decides he's going to go and try and return the jewelry that he's stolen. And so it's a bit of a journey for him. So it's a quest. And it's also examining the way stories that we tell each other can have a big effect on our psyche. So the story that the preacher told about sin and plague was something that was going to affect Finn's worldview. And I thought that was really interesting for us as storytellers to look into. So my story is called The Repentant Thief, set in Edinburgh in 1645. And thank you very much, Lisa, for including me in this anthology.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you so much, Deborah. And I will round this section up by talking about my contribution. First, I will admit I have a completely morbid fascination with the plague. I totally cop to it. I don't have a problem with it. You should not either. But why I find it fascinating, it is more so beyond the tragic events that happened, the scale of death, which Laura had mentioned, where, you know, the historians estimate that it took about 60% of Europe's population. It's the idea that people at those times, at what we often consider in our modern age to be living essentially in ignorance, they definitely had some awareness because plague had occurred over several centuries. One of the things that I often wonder is whether or not people who lived through one advent of the plague ever realized that in another instance that occurred, if they were experiencing the same thing. Again, if the population was experiencing the same thing. My contribution to the anthology is called The Heretic. It is set in Moorish Spain during the 14th century, and the main character is a Moorish scientist / minister of the court named Ibn al-Khatib. He happened to be living in Granada at the time, just as plague descended on Spain, and was able to see the disastrous effects that it had as it swept northward and westward through the country. And one of the reasons why I had been so fascinated to write about him again, I have written about him before in other stories that I've done, but one of the reasons why I was so fascinated to write about him is that his theories on contagion and how to essentially avoid the plague actually ended up in a tragic result for him. His words were considered heretical, and he was murdered, and most of his books were burned as a result. And I kept thinking to myself, now what could this man have said that would seem so horrible to people that they would have this reaction to him? And I went searching, and one of the things that I found was that in the Islamic religion, the whole concept of Islam is about surrender to God and surrendering to your fate. So whatever happens to you, that is as God intended. And I came to understand that through Ibn al-Khatib's writing, he was actually saying, no, don't surrender to your fate. If you see this thing coming to your relatives and to your location where you are, get away from it. And this was considered heretical. And that's why eventually he was branded a heretic and eventually killed. So that was quite fascinating to me to find out how simple words could have effectively changed what this man perceived his fate was going to be, because prior to that, he was well respected. As I mentioned, he was a famed court minister, he was a scientist, and I can guarantee you when he wrote those words on plague, he probably never imagined that they would ultimately seal his fate.
That's great, Lisa. We'll go and get Melodie now.
Hi everybody. One of the things that has been so wonderful about this, and I appreciate it enormously, is the way we've been able to come together as authors all over the world and interact in the creation of this book. And that has been a great joy, which you're seeing now on the screen, and it's wonderful to be part of. So thank you. So I came to this story two ways. I had just written a novel about the plague, The Scribe of Siena, my first novel, and in fact set in the time when Laura Morelli focused her work in Siena in the 1340s. I also, though, come to plague from a peculiar place, which is that I'm a scientist, a physician, and an epidemiologist. And so I'm writing grants about COVID, and I live in Brooklyn, right near the zip code that just got shut down, including one of my kids' schools, which we were not attending in any case. But so I have a personal, scientific, and literary interest in this topic. And I was really grateful to be able to consider it again when Lisa invited me to join. I decided to write about Mistras, which is a now ruined city in the southern Peloponnesus of Greece. And that was not a coincidence. I was writing another novel at the time, which I've just handed in the final version of, and I'm very excited to say the anticipation will be coming out in 2021, but that story takes place in Mistras, which is the city that was the capital of the Byzantine Empire after the fall of Constantinople. And it's in ruins now, but it is a magical place that you can visit if you ever get to travel again. And it was a tremendously important place. But I wrote the novel from the perspective of the Greeks. That is the heart of the book. And I decided that I wanted to try for this story to write about it from the perspective of one of the many groups of people that occupied Greece during its history. And I wanted to flip the camera for myself and see whether I could view Greece from the side of the Turks, who occupied Greece for 400 years. And so I wrote this story from the Turkish perspective. I wanted to see whether I could learn the history from the other side. And seeing the many sides of occupation, and Greece's history as one of recurrent occupation, was sort of my historical motivation for the story. So my story, which is called 778, for reasons you'll see when you read it, is set in Mistras, and at the time, the Ottoman Turks have occupied Greece, and the city is under Turkish control. Our protagonist, Kadri bin Ahmed, is Turkish, and he's perfectly happy with his life. He's secure in the knowledge that Ottoman rule is supreme. He's a soldier, he has a wife and a child, and everything is going fine. And then occupation is flipped on his head, and the Venetians come and invade Turkish territories and lay siege to Mistras. At that moment, he goes from being on top of the world to a prisoner in his own home, like the rest of the citizens in Mistras, who are Turks. And he begins to learn what it means to be oppressed and in an occupied land when he before was an oppressor. And that is for him sort of recurring or teaches him the history of the people who, the Greeks who have been oppressed in their own land already for 200 years. Kadri bin Ahmed ends up being an emissary to try to offer surrender to the Venetian commander Morosini, but right at that moment, and this is really what happened, plague breaks out in Mistras, and the course of history is erratically changed. That fascinates me too, not just how plague obviously has a devastating effect on individuals' health and the health of communities, but also how an instance of plague can actually flip history upside down, which is what happened. And the freedom of the Turks in Mistras was tremendously altered by that outbreak of plague. So 778, while being a story of seeing occupation from both sides and also, understanding the nature of oppression inside out, it is also a story about how we all, no matter what side we are on, can maintain hope in the face of unimaginable despair. And if there's any lesson that that translates from this story I wrote long before I knew, as we all did, that COVID was coming, that is one that I hope to carry forward. Thanks very much for inviting me to join you.
Well, that's great, Melodie. Thank you so much. We have quite a few questions to ask our authors. So what I thought I would do is that I'm going to unmute the authors and we can run some of these questions we're getting in our chat field. First, we'll start with David. David, could you answer the questions? Did the writers have to carry out extensive research for their work? If so, for how long? That's from Irem.
Great. Yes, for me, I bought several books on the Black Death. I also bought more of Petrarch's writing than I had, because I had stuff from his earlier writing, not his later in life, where he reflected greatly on the plague. I also went back and revisited the Canterbury Tales just because they're plague related, and it's the first set of plague stories to entertain people while they're in lockdown. I spent a lot of time looking at what happens to the body and how it affected people and the infection rates. And yeah, that's it. That's just how it was going around the world. So, I mean, I could pull the books off my shelf, but yes, there was extensive amount of research, because the joy for me in this is always the things I don't know, the gaps in my knowledge that fascinate me. The idea of, people exiting a house through a death door because you couldn't use the same door as the living. So every house in Italy had a waist-high door that the dead would use when they were carried out. And that's where knocking at death's door was a literal door. So things like that give me storytelling ideas to bounce off of. And that's always where the joy is for me in these stories.
That's great. Kristin, if you're here, can you answer that question too?
Yeah, sure. I did have to do a lot of research, even though it was only a short story, but I'm the type of person that once I start and I get caught up in the idea of it, I keep reading and going on. And what was particularly fascinating for me is that with all the new tools of science and analysis that are available now, they are finding just now that the story of plague in Ireland is different from what they first thought, what you would learn in school. And it's different from Europe because the Irish communities were scattered around, and it was generally the story they had to show the evidence of what plague was like in Ireland was drawn from this monk's journal, where the plague had struck the monastery and nearly everyone died. So they thought it was very much like that of Europe. But what in fact happened was that it didn't really hit the Gaels, which was the Irish communities, because they tended to be scattered around, whereas the Normans, who were trying to vie for dominance over all of Ireland and were nearly succeeding, they were clustered together in cities. And so the plague spread more quickly there. And it was only through the river valleys that you would find plague spreading. And it was actually more pneumonic plague than it was bubonic plague, which, as I understand it, our epidemiologists might know.
I can tell you.
Pneumonic plague contagious.
It spreads much faster, and it doesn't need a vector. That's the thing. It spreads sort of like COVID in that it's a pulmonary disease.
Yeah.
So it can be
exactly,
rather than need a rat or some other animal to transmit it through a flea.
And Jean,
exactly.
Jean, can you talk a little bit about your historical research too?
Well, I dug up my notes to belong today, and they're hilarious. So things like the Rialto. There were pimps, card sharps waiting at gambling tables, tourist guides, saints' relics, a visit to the glass factory brothels, jousting and bull baiting. And we've got random facts like the tariff of whores in 1535, the fact that Zoccoli were high-platformed clogs, and that cross-dressing was a good seduction method. So totally random facts all form the sort of stew that the story came from. But there were two things that were important, as well as the books and the facts and the rest of it. And one was that I spent a long time just looking at Titian's paintings and just having my own thoughts. I did look at some of the art criticism, and I have to say I was absolutely petrified that I was putting such a story in an anthology with Laura Morelli, because her art history background is superb. Her novels are fantastic. I thought, I can't do this.
Oh, no, well, Jean sent me her story and I read it and I absolutely loved it. And I especially loved the narrator, Jean. So.
Well, that was the only way I could deal with the fear of Laura Morelli. I sent her the story and said, could you check it before it actually goes to the anthology? And Kristin also has a background in Venice and the art history. So the checking things with fellow novelists and historians is really useful. And I also know Venice very well. I've been there many times. So that also answers, I think it was Julia's question about the place. Yes, I wrote about somewhere that I know the back streets.
Great. And Jessica, can you tell us a little bit about your research techniques?
I didn't have to do a tremendous amount of direct research for the story because I'm a complete Spain history nerd to begin with. I became attracted to the story that I eventually wrote because the moment that Lisa mentioned plague, what I thought of was the fact that I'm pretty sure Alfonso XI was the only monarch to have been killed by the bubonic plague on its first go around anyway. I don't know that any other monarchs were killed.
He was.
So that always fascinated me, and I always felt that that spoke to the monarchy of Spain being a little closer to the populace, perhaps, than the other European monarchs. So I immediately went to his figure and the circumstances of his death, and found a much more interesting avenue to pursue, which was that when the people he left behind, when he died, he had a queen and an heir to the throne. So that sounds tremendously boring and not like a story, except that he also had Leonor, who was probably more of a true wife than his queen ever was. She accompanied him everywhere. She advised him on politics. She bore 10 children for him. So after Alfonso died, you have this great big clash between these two powerful women. And so I did a little bit of research on that and went to my local library to read some of the interesting little tidbits, like David mentioned, kind of the statistics and most of the writings that we have about the plague in Spain are from afterward. So you have the court records that say, well, in this year, this city couldn't pay its taxes because there was nobody there, and that kind of thing. And pretty much all of it made it into the story eventually. So that was fun.
That's great, Jessica. Thank you. And Laura, I know that you are very much an expert in Italian history. Could you tell us a little bit about how you researched for this book?
Sure. I mean, for me, the research is just a joy. I mean, I love it. And as I mentioned before, I always begin a project with primary sources. And certainly for the Black Death, the primary sources are sometimes chilling, sometimes funny, always instructive. And I think when you read a primary source, what people wrote at the time, you really step into the mind of people living in a particular time and place. And so that's the reason why that's always a starting point for me. There were two other things that were fun research-wise for my story, Little Bird. One was that I got to really research the history of painting pigments in 14th century Tuscany. And, you know, as someone who is interested in artist techniques, that was really fascinating to read some of the scientific analysis about pigments that have been discovered and that were used in the 14th century. We know that artists were grinding all kinds of different snail shells, as well as, of course, plants and other kinds of things to produce these highly coveted dyes and colors. And so that was a fun sort of rabbit hole for this story. And I only mention it because the pigments play a role in I won't spoil it, but they play a role in Little Bird's story. And then finally, another thing that was really fun was to go back and look again at the art of the Lorenzetti brothers in Siena. And so if you want to see some beautiful 14th century Italian wall painting, just Google Lorenzetti and you will see these beautiful wall paintings that these brothers did on the walls of the Palazzo Pubblico, which was sort of the town hall of Siena in the 14th century. Now, this last bit, I guess, falls in the category of you can't make this stuff up. Go and Google The Allegory of Good and Bad Government by the Lorenzetti, and look at the wonderful personified figure of bad government that Ambrogio Lorenzetti, who I mentioned himself died of this great mortality, painted in the mid 1300s. And so looking at those pictures again after years being outside the art history classroom was a lot of fun for me.
That's great. Thank you so much. And Deborah, we're curious, there's a question here about in Edinburgh, you say you drew some ideas about the plague from a map in Edinburgh. Where did you get your research on the quarantine camp?
So that came from a JSTOR article. So I get a lot of my research from online articles, from academic journals, and JSTOR is an international place where you can get articles if you subscribe. And so that came from there, and the map was included in the academic document, which I think was somebody's thesis. So somebody else, some hard-working student, had done this work for me and provided me with the map, and also with some really interesting information about their lockdown procedures, which involved taking anybody who was infected with the plague out of the city and installing them in a rudimentary hut outside the borders of the town, and you weren't allowed to come back for a month, and you either died there in this hut, which was apparently more like a chicken coop than a home, or you survived. If you survived, you were really lucky and were able to go home again. But whilst you were away, somebody may have looted your house. So there was a lot of interest actually just in the way people were treated during this plague. And if you refused to go to Boromur, which is where they took you to the huts, then you could be hanged, or you could be thrown in a duck pond and drowned. So, and this all came from this same thesis, which I think was about 40 pages long. The trouble with historical stories is always trying to fit that amount of research into such a short space of time and such a short story. And I think, although I used a lot of documents in the research, probably only about a third of that went into the story in the end. There just wasn't the space for all of it.
Fascinating. Thank you for sharing that. Melodie, could you tell us, I know that your first book also dealt with this same sort of situation, but what other research had you come across in dealing with the plague in 778?
Yeah, so this is really funny. I mean, I take a little bit of an opportunistic, and for this book, approach to finding sources, which is that I was at the time writing my second novel on deadline, and I said, God, if I'm going to write a short story, I'd better be able to use what I'm already looking up to some degree, otherwise I'm going to be in trouble. So part of it turned out to be that, although I set myself a very difficult task by using a period that was hundreds of years beyond where I had started writing already. So and I think, you know, that was part of the challenge, was to figure out what that century looked like. What does the 17th century looks like? And what is it like to be Turkish in the 17th century, none of which I knew anything about. But also, I think what ended up happening that led to this story, research-wise, is very much the way my research for historical fiction goes, which is a small, peculiar discovery that seems almost accidental, that explodes into a narrative. And so at the time, it's almost hilarious in retrospect, that I was planning my second novel. I wasn't really sure what I was going to write about entirely, but I was seeing patients because I'm a doctor, and I have a Greek colleague, Michael Darris, who came in while I was between patients to see how I was doing, because it was a particularly bad day and I was pacing the halls, very overbooked. And he's once I was done with the patient, he said, you know, I said I was thinking about going to Greece, and he said, here's where you should go. And he took a back of an envelope and started drawing on it. And he showed me this place, Mistras. I said, well, what's Mistras? And he said, oh, it's an abandoned city in the southern Peloponnesus. I said, wow, that sounds interesting. And he didn't tell me much more about it. And then on the way home, I puzzled over that and then put it away, the envelope, which I now have actually on my wall as a memory of how that spawned a novel. But it also spawned a short story, because several weeks after that, we were having a yard sale. And I said, you know, I'm going to look through the books that were left to us by the previous owner, which we had just put into an attic storeroom basically and not looked at again because we didn't have time, and see whether there's anything I'd like to either read or sell. And in doing that, I found a book with a spine I couldn't read that I had not noticed when we put them all in there. And I pulled it out, and it was called Castles of the Morea. And the Morea was the French word for the Peloponnesus during its occupation by the French, who were the first people, they were called Franks at the time, to take over Greece, that part of Greece. And I flipped it open, and it opened to a chapter on Mistras, which I had never heard of until my colleague had mentioned it. And then I have this book that's in my attic that I didn't know I owned, and there it is again. And then I said, okay, fine, I understand. I'm being told to write about this place that I know nothing about, which I ended up visiting and dragging my, at that time, quite young children through for 7 hours in 90-degree heat. So that was, well, actually it was not 90-degree heat because it was December, but they were very tired and hot anyway, and there were pictures of them miserable at the end of it. So my research began, you know, about Mistras for my book, but then there's this one paragraph, I went back to that book, and there's one paragraph in which it describes how the plague in Mistras changed the course of history for the Turkish occupation. And I never found that reference anywhere else, and pursued it through this one small source, which was almost accidental, to create an entire story, because I'm so fascinated by those sort of the events on which history turns, that moment, the argument, the conversation, the infection, whatever it is, that has so much power, especially in a narrative where you're limited to 5 or 10 pages, and you have something explosive has to happen very fast.
Thank you, Melodie. That's fantastic that the fates sort of interceded on your behalf. Lisa, can you tell us about your 14th century historical figure? How did you find out information about someone that far back in the past?
Through lots and lots of digging, because I can tell you, he of himself did not leave a lot of information. Not only were his writings burnt, but he never really spoke about himself. It was only through researching more of his life, because obviously I knew a lot about Moorish Spain at the time. I knew about his role as a minister, but up until maybe 4 years before I did the contribution to the anthology, I never knew anything about him, like his family life or anything. So I had to basically pull all of that together. By that time, I knew that he had been married, had 3 sons, but the most fascinating element that I found about him was he had a very close relationship. He became eventually the prime minister to the Moorish Sultan. And his predecessor, I thought, was just someone that he had admired because he had written all of these poems and stuff in honor of him. And then I researched that man's life. His name was Ibn al-Jayb. And as I started to look at his life, I realized that there was a lot of information about his then interactions with my main character, Ibn al-Khatib, only to find out when I was writing this story that Ibn al-Khatib's father died in around 1340. He had died. And at that time, Ibn al-Khatib was sort of this, I guess you would call him a social climber of 14th century Spain, because at the time he was trying to marry into the best family and stuff, but this is what they had to do in order to really succeed and gain the attention of the Sultan, who would then invite him to court. So he was looking for the perfect wife. And Ibn al-Jayb had not only apparently been his mentor, but when Ibn al-Khatib's father died, Ibn al-Jayb actually also stepped in as a foster father to sort of help my character out. Interestingly, he was not the one that found him his wife. I don't know how that relationship occurred, because she doesn't seem to have been a woman of notable circumstances like was required of a high minister of Granada. But Ibn al-Jayb definitely had this influence in his life, and none of it was in Ibn al-Khatib's own writings and stuff that I was able to find. And once I started with that small kernel of a guy who was his predecessor in the ministerial court, was then his foster father, then I found out the circumstances under which the foster father died, the dad died, and all these people around him. And I came to realize that this must have been the reason why Ibn al-Khatib flouted all of the, I guess, sort of the religious and social mores, and decided to talk about the fact that, you know, you don't just surrender to your fate like our religion requires, you do something about it, because he was losing people to this disease. He never actually states that in this. He wrote this beautiful, absolutely beautiful funerary poem in honor of his foster father, and he talks about the loss. He did the same thing for his wife, but he never specified that these were incidents because of the Black Death, or at the time that they were calling it the Great Plague. I don't think he ever talked about that aspect of it, but he certainly talked about his grief and his pain, and I just found that very fascinating for someone who had spent so much of his life really just focused on his work as a courtier. To get that little bit of personal information about him, that was a complete gem for me.
Wow, that's fabulous. Thank you so much, Lisa. We're going to just do a real quick round robin from Sarah's question. She wants to know, are there aspects of life during the COVID current pandemic now that makes you think, yay, I got that right? So we'll start with David. If you could unmute and tell us if there was an aspect of your story that is very timely for today.
Not in more than the general sense. It's the sense of trying to be helpful to people, and of course the caretakers then catching the disease, and it spiraling out from that. That was a big theme in mine.
Excellent. And Deborah, what about you? What did you find that's contemporary in the plague back then?
So much of it is contemporary, it's hard to pick anything out. But I think certainly the lockdown and how we all cope with that. And I'm really privileged to be a writer and to be able to actually enjoy writing during this time. And when so many other people's livelihood or the thing that they mostly do in the daytime has had to stop. And it was the same back then, that everybody's lives were put on hold. Nobody could go to their job. It was exactly the same. And it was quite mind-blowing when I looked back at my story, having read it only recently in preparation for this talk today, that I had got so much right, and that quite surprised me because I had no idea it was coming. So it just shows you the power of our imaginations, is actually to be able to imagine ourselves into somebody else's shoes is the great power and the great privilege of the novelist.
Oh, beautifully put. Jean Gill, can you tell us what you think is similar today as back then?
Venetian politics actually had a lot in common with modern politics, and the rivalry between the two doctors, we do see some attempts to make money out of the possibility of cures for what's coming in the future. But I also think the treasures of creativity, and from that period when everything was so difficult, there was great creativity as well. I think there is now.
Fabulous. Jessica, can you tell us your viewpoint on that?
I think the main thing that I'm experiencing that's the same is the sense of bewilderment. Here's this thing nobody was expecting. What do we do now? It's very, very similar throughout history. Also, obviously, things like feelings of loss and sorrow are the same throughout the ages. And I'm happy to say that resilience and hope are also staying the same throughout the ages.
Excellent. And Kristin, do you have something to add to this?
Well, I'd say that like Jean said, the politics are still present now. maybe slightly different then, but people are fearful, people don't obey, they don't know who to trust. And I'd say that was very much the case then. It was dealing with the unknown. I mean, in 1349, it was definitely unknown. It was the first time this kind of plague had ever entered Ireland. And fear drives people to do different things. But also there's a test to the human spirit that I think is universal, and also a sense that people, when tested, a lot of them will rise to the test and meet it and come through well. But, you know, that's whether it's lost or dealing with the fear.
Excellent. And Jean, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, what was particularly interesting in Venice was you've got the trading capital of Europe, and the horrible decision to close borders versus people's livelihoods. And that was just so relevant to today. It's a question of which way do you want to die? Difficult answers.
Very timely. And Laura, what do you have to add to that?
Well, I think that it's interesting to realize that anytime there is a communal crisis, as much as there are people who rise to the challenge, there are also snake oil salesmen out there who are ready to take advantage of gullible people. And certainly that was true during the Black Death as it is today.
And Melodie, you being a doctor and a scientist, you must see some amazing correlations, what was happening back in your story's time and today. The doctor may be seeing a patient. I know she's, I'm going to unmute her real quick. So Melodie?
Yeah, sorry, I was talking. I didn't realize I was still muted.
No,
I wasn't even going to talk about my doctor experience, although really it is remarkably similar in that we can't seem to do anything about it. I mean, we have begun to do a little. We're doing better than we were, but at the medical community, we still rely on staying away from one another in order to stay safe, because treatment is not really vastly better than it was. And that is a surprise, I would say, in our modern world, to be doing as badly as people did then. However, what I feel like my story captured that feels very familiar now is how really devastatingly enormous changes like this shift your perspective as an individual, how you realize what matters, how you see things in a different light. The people talk to me about this a lot, about how the things that I thought I had no time for, I wish I could do now. The people who I was putting off seeing, I wish I could have near me. And so that shift in perspective very much colors this story about how you think you've got your life all right. And then when you lose everything that you thought you had, how does your way of looking at the world shift and what matters to you? The other thing I think, which some have reflected on, is this sort of weird juxtaposition between the personal and the political, the large scale and the small. So you have your individual tragedy, but you're part of a global tragedy, and the way that the movement of nations, which didn't really exist. Well, I guess by the 17th century there were, but this concept of nationhood and how we as countries or as people interact with one another as a result of this plague, and the way it is a shared experience across the world, as well as a horribly personal experience, that also is reflected in this story. And so, and I feel it is in all of them, that kind of terrible juxtaposition between the individual tragedy and the global tragedy.
Fabulous. Thank you so much. And Lisa, what did you find in terms, especially you're so apt about the political arena in your story? Do you see similarities about what is happening today?
Yes, unfortunately, to echo a lot of what Melodie says, yes, it does amaze me how the modern day approach to COVID feels it felt very familiar as I thought about what I had written in The Heretic. There's actually a scene that takes place between three of the court ministers This would be Ibn al-Khatib, his foster father, Ibn al-Jayb, and a young doctor who Ibn al-Khatib mentored and who was a close friend of his. And they're having a discussion, and one says to the other, well, you know, we can't shut down the economy. We really have to think about if we close up the kingdom and prevent all trade, what's going to happen. And then the other doctor in the room says to Ibn al-Khatib, well, you know, this will all go away. It'll be just fine once the weather changes. And as I was thinking, you know, of myself having written that scene and listening to the politics of today, I'm going, boy, that sure sounds familiar. So it was interesting to sort of have those, I guess, unintended parallels come out in the story, and then to hear them in modern day politics was a bit weird and surprising.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Julia would like to know, and I'm going to do another round robin. Her question is, did the authors get to visit these cities or countries to get inspiration for their stories? So David, can we take it with you again? Did you visit your site in Italy based in your story?
Yes, it was a very specific site. I've been there twice. I was lucky enough to be invited by Dante's descendant, the Count Sergio Alighieri, to stay at his vineyard that Pietro bought in 1353. They still create wine there. If you buy Masi wine and Valpolicella Amarone, it comes from that vineyard. And so my wife and I, in 2014, were invited to stay while I was doing a book signing in Italy. And parts of the story were based on just my experience of staying there. And I wrote this song usually I steal songs. This time I actually wrote one. I wrote it for this story because there was a lemon tree, just one solitary lemon tree growing in the middle of the grounds. Mm-hmm. And I created it as a childhood memory for the children who were now dying in the story. And that one evocative, that it really stood out to me that this one lone lemon tree was sitting on this vineyard. And it really snapped together a lot of pieces of the story for me. So yes, it's an amazing place. You can go, they actually let people stay there from time to time. But imagine living in a museum. You know, there's an inlaid marble floor with the family crest and the marriage carriage where the Sergio family married into the Alighieri family in 14 whatever. And then there's a stereo in the corner and plastic cubes with the daughter's photos in there. So it's a very lived-in museum, and it's a fascinating experience.
And this is actually in the city of Gargano. Am I pronouncing that correctly?
This is north of Verona. It's in the Valpolicella region. The place is called the Villa Ronchi.
Great. And if you could type that into the chat for our people who are asking, that'd be fabulous. Now we're going to go on to Deborah. Deborah, could you tell us, did you go to Edinburgh? Did you see where this quarantine camp was outside the city limits?
Yes, I've seen the quarantine camp, but what will fascinate people if they actually go to Edinburgh and do any research around this is that there is now a visitor centre with St Mary's Close, which was supposedly a place where people were bricked up during the plague. This is not actually true, but it makes a wonderful visitor experience. And of course, it's a great tourist attraction in Edinburgh. Most of my information came from sources from books and from the library and from JSTOR. But I did actually visit the moor where the huts were, but of course there's nothing left now. And like all novelists, you have to, when you go there, it's not necessarily what you're expecting, and you're having to then overlay with your mind what might have been there in the 17th century. So interesting to get some atmosphere, but it didn't really help me much. Things have changed and moved on so much in the city since then.
Fabulous. And Kristin, can you tell us, did you visit the actual site where your story, The Blood of the Gaels, takes place?
Well, I walked over because right near me where the convent possibly was situated during St. Gubnet's time, it's now a sacred site. It's where St. Gubnet is buried. There's a holy well there. And the people of Ballyvorne, where it is, and also people from all over Ireland and sometimes all over the world come there to do what's called the rounds, which is an ancient ritual where you go in circles 9 times. So there's very pre-Christian kind of element to it. And so you have a ruined round house there, and then a cemetery, and then her burial site. So, and her bala, which was a healing metal ball that people passed around up until the 1990s to keep with them if they were ill. So I went there and sat there and looked out. I go there quite often, actually, because there's something about the place that is really compelling. And it just has an atmosphere there. And so I had visited there again before I was writing the story. And then I also visited the home place, which is a ruined fort in East Cork. And because these are actual characters or clans that were in history, and I just took their names and created a story behind them. So they're kind of actual figures. So I went to both sites, and I'm very fortunate that there's still something there. And it is a place that's set aside that isn't touched or built around or anything. One is in a field, a farmer's field, which is the way it is over here. There's nothing fussy about it. You just go there and you can just be there in the ruins.
Oh, that's fantastic. Thank you, Jean. I want to point out that in the anthology, each one of the authors has a lovely essay at the back describing their approach and some thoughts about their writing. Now we're going on to Jean Gill, who wrote A Certain Shade of Red about Titian. Did you go to Venice, Jean, to see where he painted?
Yes, my husband and I first went to Venice on school trips about 30 years ago. So if you can imagine us with 50 teenagers trying to take our little hour here and there to look at something cultural, while said teenagers got up to mischief or said how boring Venice was, we were determined to go there without the kids, and we're talking 50 of them. So we did, and we've been back to Venice, just the two of us, perhaps 5 times or 6 times now, I've lost track, and spent a week there each time, seen it in different moods. And I do what I call romance and research trips. And my husband asked me what I'm writing next, because he gets quite excited if we're going somewhere interesting. So Venice is good. But when I was writing about medieval Wales, he passed on that trip because we lived there for 25 years. So that was a no thank you. But Venice was very much somewhere that I looked around with Titian in my mind before writing the story. And we went to see paintings, and I saw them differently because of my research, because he's real to me now. He lives now.
That's lovely. And Jessica, your short story Footsteps, did you actually visit the place where Lady Lenore was walled up?
I did. I was very pleased to have a chance to write this story, because when I was learning about Leonor, I was able to picture her imprisoned in the royal palace in Sevilla. And I've spent many ecstatic hours in that place. So there are many worse places a person could be imprisoned. It's an extraordinary building with different, levels of medieval constructions. So I had to kind of remove mentally the parts that came afterwards and think about what the ambiance would have been like there. And that writing that part of the story was loads of fun, because it was kind of like a love letter to one of my favorite places in the world. And then specifically for this story, I also made it a point to go to Talavera de la Reina, which I had never been to before. And I saw the towers of the medieval castle, and they're just so very severe, and imagining being locked up there was a very different experience. So I was really glad to have that kind of physical context to write the final part of the story. I was there on a hellishly hot day So I hope Winawer didn't melt away.
Fabulous. You depicted it so brilliantly in your writing. I really felt it. And Laura, and talking about Lorenzetti's artwork, you talk about something called the presentation of the Christ Child in the Cathedral in Siena. Did you actually see it?
Yes, and you know, it's Siena. I lived in Italy for several years, and I was in Siena in the summer of 2018, and I stood in front of that cathedral, and I tried to imagine what it might have looked like in 1348, because Siena was really a very wealthy town before the Black Death hit. And the cathedral was actually under construction. And as soon as the plague came to town, then they halted construction. And I just imagine this huge building with some of the beautiful marble colored slabs on the exterior. And then, you know, this part with these foundations that was just sort of abandoned. And the city never really recovered economically to the point that it was before the Black Death. And the other thing that made its way into the story is the Palio, the famous horse race that takes place in Siena twice a year. It's a centuries old tradition where the 17 contrade or neighborhoods of Siena compete against one another by racing their horses as fast as they possibly can around this dirt-filled square in the center of town. And if you ever go to the Palio, like my family did like a couple summers ago, it's barely controlled chaos. And it's just these horses running as fast as they possibly can around this square. And we were invited by the Val di Montone neighborhood, by some friends there, to attend some pre and post Palio festivities, which involves each neighborhood putting out these long tables, and they corral all the teenagers from the neighborhood to cook dinner and serve everyone. So we sat down, and these very friendly teens came over and brought us big heaping plates of pasta, and lots of wine is poured, and songs are sung, and they bring out their horse that's that's been racing earlier in the day, and everybody comes and oohs and ahs over the horse. So it's a very particular tradition in Siena, and so it's something that I wanted to bring into my story as well.
Well, it was a terrific depiction of a city being full of life and also being full of death. So I thought you did an excellent job with that. And Melodie, can you tell us, when you went to the island of Mistras, did you know that you were going to be writing your character from the Turkish point of view?
So no, so it's not an island actually. Just to clarify, it's okay. It's a ruined city on the top of a conical hill. It's a very peculiar place. I did not know at all that I was going to be writing the story when I was there. I went there with the intent of writing the novel, and the story kind of came out as a side amusement. But I'll tell you the thing about Mistras that's so remarkable. I mean, it's a very peculiar place in that it's got the backdrop of the Taygetos Mountains behind it, these huge 5 snow-capped peaks rising out of this beautiful verdant valley in the south of Greece. And at the foot of those peaks is this weird cone-shaped hill that's by itself. And on top of that little hill is the city, which is now almost entirely in ruins, but not completely. And yet the entire city is still there, and you can walk through it. There are 15 churches with, Byzantine art and mosaic floors. The city walls are still there and the gates. And actually there is a working convent, the monastery of the Pantanassa, which is still there, and the nuns live there, in their cells, and there are cats sleeping on the steps. But then as soon as you exit this perfect building and go out the Monemvasia gate, you're in ruins again with donkeys munching on grass. It's a truly magical and extraordinary place. There is a museum at the bottom of the hill, and there's a lot of renovation going on, but it is, it's at the bottom of the hill is the little tiny modern town of Mistras. So my feeling going into it when I was there was that this kind of, and I think historical fiction drives a lot of us this way, was this profound desire to bring it back to life. because there's hardly anything there. I wanted to see it humming with people. I wanted to understand, what did the houses look like? What was for sale? Who was on the street? How crowded was it? What did it smell like? Where were people from? What was happening? Where did people congregate? What were they eating? You know, and I think that drive, you know, in every historical fiction writer's heart, and maybe historical fiction reader's heart too, because I was certainly that and still am, is to reawaken the day-to-day life of a place. Because the book that I wrote, the novel, which is just done, covers 800 years, not all of it. It's not like some horrible 17-volume work, but I had to know 800 years of history to do it, which was horribly difficult. And I'm still panicked thinking about how I managed to read all that. But in any case, this difficulty that I had of setting it in the Turkish place and time is that it was at the time I was reading about the 13th century when I had to write about the 17th century. And so, you know, that reimagining what all the different moments were in the life of this city that existed from 1249 until 1953, when the last inhabitants left. I mean, it's really extraordinary, dramatic. It was just almost completely destroyed by the Turks in the 1820s, but a few people hung on, and they were finally extracted in the 1950s. So to really understand the history of that place is this very long time where you actually learn the history of Greece, you know, of recurrent occupation, of the birth of nationhood, about how the concept of what it means to be Greek arises during the Enlightenment and this, you know, after the French Revolution. So, you know, I feel like that place for me embodied the history of a place that is much bigger than it, even though it's a tiny ruined place that hardly any of you probably have ever seen.
It's amazing. You
It is
know
amazing.
so much about it.
Wish I could
Lisa, could you tell us about your research into Granada? Did you go where your main character was? She's here.
For a couple of years, I probably spent a little bit too much time in Spain. Between 2001 and 2013, I would go every year in the guise that I was doing research. But what I was going because I loved the place so much. And at the time, I was working on a series set in Spain, so hence all the frequent trips. And there is something that I must tell you, there is something about walking in the space where the historical figures that you're writing about as a novelist walked. I remember the first time I went in 2001, and the sound that stays with me was, I was there in November because I knew already never to go to Spain during the summer because I would literally just melt on the cobblestones of Granada. But there was this sound that just stayed with me of my boot heels sort of clicking on the cobblestones of old Granada, or just hearing water as it would sort of murmur through these channels in the Alhambra's gardens and stuff. And it was just this really evocative image that always stayed with me. So I had spent quite a lot of time in the space itself, but the one place that I never actually visited, which is still standing apparently, is the house where Ibn al-Khatib lived. It is apparently on the south of the Alhambra complex, and while you can go to the area, obviously these buildings are, I'm sure they're so dilapidated and stuff inside that you could never be allowed to tour inside the place, but it would have been nice to actually just see the facade of it and know that's where he lived.
That's great. We're going to do one last question from our audience here, and this one is more of a personal question. It was asking from Cynthia, did any of the authors find out that their own family or family hometown experienced the plague? And David, we'll start with you.
No. My family is so scattered in terms of where they all come from. I have such a hodgepodge of ancestry that and I can't trace it further back than 100 years. So it's not something I've done. Sorry.
So your family dodged the bullet. That's good. Deborah, did you find that any of your family had experienced the plague in Edinburgh?
No, I didn't find any of my family have had anything to do with the plague. And actually that for me is good, because I had no preconceptions about what I was going to write about or anything about the story. So I could just start with a clean slate. So that was good for me not to know.
Excellent. And Jean, what about you?
No, but my most famous ancestor was probably an expert in isolation, and that was Alexander Selkirk, the original Robinson Crusoe.
You have to write that book now, since you've said it.
Yeah, I know.
Kristin, what about you?
Well, I can't top that, I'm afraid. Well, I'm originally from Philadelphia, but my father and my mother's parents were English, and my grandmother was Irish. So I can imagine that their ancestors might have, but I have no direct knowledge of it because it's difficult to do research back to 1349, and I haven't had the energy. I did a lot with genealogists and never had the time to do my own.
And what about you, Jessica?
Well, my heritage is German. The family ancestry has been traced back only to the 1600s, so we just don't know.
And Laura, what about you?
I don't know either. My father left behind a fascinating manila folder when he passed away that had one piece of paper inside, and it was the ancestry.com password. And so after he passed away, I dove right into Ancestry, and I found that he had traced one line of our family back to Switzerland in the 13th century. So that's as far back as we went down that family line, but I'm not aware of anybody that experienced the plague directly. Who knows?
Interesting. And Melodie, what about your family? Did you find any connections to them experiencing the plague?
Oh, not at all. We are Jews in the diaspora. So, so we are, Eastern European polyglot, borders moving back and forth all the time, Russia, Poland, Lithuania. Everybody either left or was killed during the Holocaust. Those who stayed died. Those who came made it. So my great-grandmother on my mother's side and my grandmother and grandfather on my father's side came to the US from Russia and Poland and Lithuania. And their relatives were all killed behind them. And they never saw anybody again. So it's a little bit of a different story. We don't trace back our roots. And in a lot of ways, I think most people on this call probably know this from history. Jews don't really belong to the place where we are often when we're in Europe. So even though my grandmother spoke Polish, she spoke mostly Yiddish. Recently when our kids who went to a very international school for elementary school, because we have such an international neighborhood here in Brooklyn, there was this, international celebration day when all the kids got up and sang their national anthems and wore the clothes from their country and cooked their own food. And they said, "Where are we from? Are we from Poland? Are we from Russia? Are we from Lithuania?" And I said, "Well, no, yes, no, yes, no, yes, no." So we've had a lot of ongoing discussions about where we really are from, not Israel, not a lot of these places. And so since we had recently been to Nicaragua, they decided to stand up for that culture celebration.
That's lovely. And Lisa, what about your family? Did you find that they had any experience with plague in the past?
No, not at all. I've been able to trace some family history back to the 1800s, and I am an Ancestry member as well. For all of us in the family who've done the DNA test, we all through the matrilineal line, we all come up with this 4% Irish in our blood, 4 to 5% Irish, which I always find fascinating. And quite an interesting history about Barbados as well. Its original colonists. This was one of the places like Australia where you sent the dregs of society. So I am sure that I probably have probably some sort of Irish prisoner of war or something who's probably one of my ancestors, and that's how he ended up in Barbados and stuff. But no, fortunately not. I have not found anything that suggests any sort of plague, anything in the family.
Well, I'm glad that you all survived to write this lovely book. It's been an
Yes.
hour and a half, so what we're going to do is one last pass through where each author can sort of sign off and just give a little synopsis of their story. And I'll put the links to where to buy the anthology in the chat field. But David, let's take it with you first. Can you just tell us a little bit about your story, just in a brief summation?
Great. So I'm David Blixt. My story is On All Our Houses. It is the tale of impending grief of the loss of a child, as Dante's son and Petrarch tour the grounds one last time before Pietro says goodbye to his daughter.
Great. All right, Deborah, could you tell us a little bit about your work?
Story is The Repentant Thief. It's about Irish immigrant Finn, who comes to Scotland and is impressed by a local preacher who suggests that sin causes plague and he has sinned. So he has to do something about it.
Oh, that's great. And Kristin, can you tell us about your book, your story?
Yeah, it's called Blood of the Gaels. It's set in 1349, and it's the story of a woman, Maeve, young postulant to a convent, who has to journey to her home to tend her father, not knowing whether it's plague or something else, and then discovering it's something even more sinister.
And Jean, can you tell us about your writing?
Thanks.
A Certain Shade of Red, set in Venice and exploring the mystery of Titian's death and life. And it won second prize in the HNS conference in Glasgow short story competition. And I just want to say to everybody, make the most of that conference because you will meet such fantastic people. And I've got to thank Lisa for bringing all this together and everyone for being such good company. It's been really, really good.
Fabulous. And Jessica, can you tell us about your writing?
My story for this anthology is called Footsteps. It starts with one of the sieges of Gibraltar, where Alfonso XI dies, and follows Leonor with the funeral cortege up to Sevilla, where she faces her archenemy, Queen Maria.
Excellent. And Laura, can you tell us about Little Bird?
Yes, Laura Morelli. My story is Little Bird. It follows a young girl with a mysterious and extraordinary gift as she enters Siena in 1348 with a band of cure sellers, just as the great mortality begins to descend on the city.
Fabulous. Melodie, can you tell us about your 778?
Sure, I'm Melodie Winawer, and my story 778 is about Turkish Kadri bin Ahmed, who's in the Greek city of Mistras, occupying it, and loses almost everything, family and freedom and hope, until he realizes that he has something left as he's facing what should be despair in the face of the plague.
Excellent. And Lisa, she is our host for today. She's also going to make an announcement about someone winning some things at the end of her description. So Lisa, can you take it away?
Absolutely. Again, Lisa Yarde, and my contribution was The Heretic, which is about the 14th century figure of Ibn al-Khatib, who was a doctor writing at the time of the Black Death in Spain. He wrote a controversial treatise about it, and it eventually cost him his life. Again, I want to thank everyone for being a part of our audience today. I really appreciate it. And as was mentioned, we're going to give away 3 copies in ebook format to 3 lucky attendees. So Irem, Sarah, and Paula, who asked the first couple of questions, I will be following up with you in order to provide you with the free copy of the anthology.
Well, that was a fascinating international forum. Thank you everyone for signing in from all over the globe. I highly recommend this book. It's touching, it's moving. I feel it could not be more timely in surviving what we're going through now. And there are links on our Historical Novel Chapter Facebook page. Faith Justice, do you want to sign us off for this meeting?
Yes, thank you again, everybody. This was an absolutely fascinating panel, and as the comments in the chat, show, everybody just thought it was awesome, and I want to thank you all again for getting together with us across the globe. There, I said it, across the globe. So thanks, everybody, and hope you can check in with us in November, where we get to talk a little politics, particularly women in politics. Take care.
Yeah.
Thank you. It's wonderful.
Bye.
Bye, everybody. Thank you for signing in.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. This was fantastic.